Imagine a philosopher in ancient Athens, 360 years before Christ was born, sitting in the shade of an olive tree, telling his students about a lost civilization, a city of impossible wealth and power, concentric rings of water and land, walls covered in shining metal, palaces filled with gold, ships that ruled the seas, a society so advanced, so mighty, that it seemed touched by the gods themselves. And then, in a single day and night, it was gone, swallowed by earthquakes and floods, lost beneath the waves forever. For 2,400 years, this story has captivated humanity. Explorers have searched every ocean. Scientists have argued. Treasure hunters have dreamed. Entire careers have been built on finding this one lost city. But here is the question we will answer tonight. What do the ancient sources actually tell us about Atlantis? Not the Hollywood movies, not the conspiracy theories, not the psychics or the pseudoscience. Tonight, we go back to the source, to the only man who ever wrote about Atlantis while the ancient world still lived, to the texts themselves. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I'm always curious, where in the world are you joining me tonight? New York, Texas, or somewhere far away? Let me know in the comments. Now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. And let us travel back 24 centuries to the city of Athens to meet the man who started it all. His name was Plato. Chapter 1. The Philosopher and His Story. Athens in 360 BC was a city haunted by its own past. Just a generation before, it had been the greatest power in Greece. Its democratic empire stretched across the Aegean Sea. Its navy was unmatched. Its culture was the envy of the world. Playwrights like Sophocles filled its theatres. Sculptors like Phidias carved immortal masterpieces. The Parthenon gleamed white and gold on the Acropolis, a temple to Athena and to Athenian pride. But then came the long, brutal Peloponnesian War against Sparta. Athens lost. Its empire crumbled. Its walls were torn down. The Golden Age was over. Into this wounded city, still trying to understand what went wrong, came a philosopher named Plato. He was in his 60s now, the founder of a school called the Academy. His teacher, Socrates, had been executed by the city decades before. That death had shaped everything Plato believed. Plato was obsessed with a single question. What makes a perfect society? He had already written his masterwork, The Republic, a dialogue exploring the ideal state, but theory was not enough. He wanted to show what happens when a perfect society actually exists, when it rises and when it falls. And so, around 360 BC, he began writing two dialogues. One was called Timaeus. The other was called Critias. In these works, he would tell the story of two ancient civilizations. One was Athens itself, 9,000 years before his time. The other was its rival and opposite, Atlantis. But Plato was clever. He did not present this as fiction. He framed it as history. The story, he claimed, came from his ancestor Solon, the great Athenian lawmaker. Solon had travelled to Egypt around 590 BC, more than 2 centuries before Plato's time. There, in the sacred city of Sais, in the Nile Delta, he met with Egyptian priests, the keepers of the world's oldest records. These priests, according to Plato, told Solon something shocking. They said that the Greeks were like children. They had no deep memory. Every few generations, they were wiped out by floods or fires or plagues, and they had to start civilization over again. Their history only went back a few centuries. But Egypt, the priest said, had records stretching back thousands upon thousands of years. And in those records was a story the Greeks had completely forgotten. A story of their own greatest triumph. 9,000 years ago, they said, Athens had been a mighty city. It was governed by wise laws. Its people were brave and virtuous. It was, in every way, the ideal state. And then, From beyond the Pillars of Hercules, from the great ocean that surrounded the known world, came an enemy. A vast island empire called Atlantis. This was the setup, a story within a story within a story. Plato, writing about Critias, who is remembering Solon, who is recounting the words of Egyptian priests, who are reading from ancient records. Was it true? Or was it an elaborate literary device to give weight to a philosophical parable? That question has burned for 2,400 years. Chapter 2. Timaeus, the first mention. The dialogue called Timaeus is where Atlantis first appears in human literature. Plato sets the scene carefully. Socrates, his beloved teacher, is talking with three men, Timaeus, Hermocrates, and Critias. They are discussing the nature of the universe, the structure of reality itself. But before they dive into cosmic philosophy, Critias interrupts. He says he has a story to tell. A true story, he insists, passed down through his family. A story that will show what a perfect state looks like in action. And then he begins. He tells them about Solon's visit to Egypt. He describes the temple at Sais, the priests, with their ancient scrolls. And then he repeats what they told Solon. 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place it around 9600 BC, and 11,400 years ago, from where we sit today, Athens was already a city. But it was not the Athens of Plato's time. It was governed by laws given by the goddess Athena herself. Its people were courageous, disciplined, and just. It was a society of farmers and warriors, living in harmony. And then came the threat. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the strait we now call Gibraltar, lay the true ocean, the Atlantic. And in that ocean was an island. An island larger, Plato says, than Libya and Asia combined. From this island, you could travel to other islands, and from those islands to the opposite continent that surrounded the entire ocean. This is a strange and fascinating detail. Plato seems to be describing a world geography that includes land beyond the Atlantic, a vast continent on the other side. This is thousands of years before Columbus. Thousands of years before Europeans knew the Americas existed. On this great island was a powerful civilization. It was ruled by kings descended from Poseidon, the god of the sea. These kings commanded a massive navy and a mighty army. They were ambitious and hungry for conquest. The kings of Atlantis did not stop at their own island. They conquered other lands. They took control of the coast of Libya as far as Egypt. They subdued parts of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, which we know as Italy. They ruled a vast empire, and then they turned their gaze toward Greece. The Atlanteans assembled a great invasion force. Their fleet sailed through the Pillars of Hercules into the Mediterranean. They attacked. Their goal was to enslave all the peoples of the Mediterranean world. But Athens stood against them. Alone, when other Greek cities had fallen or surrendered, Athens fought. Its soldiers, though outnumbered, were brave and skilled. They threw back the Atlantean forces. They pursued them. And at the moment of their greatest victory, nature itself intervened. There were earthquakes of unimaginable violence. There were floods. And in the span of a single day and night, the entire Athenian army was swallowed by the earth. At the same time, the island of Atlantis, that great and terrible empire, sank beneath the waves and vanished forever. The sea where Atlantis once stood, Plato writes, became unnavigable. It was clogged with shallow mud, the remnants of the destroyed island. And that is all the dialogue Timaeus tells us. It is brief, almost casual. A story to set the stage for deeper philosophical discussion. But it was enough. Enough to plant a seed that would grow for millennia. Chapter 3. Critias, the detailed description. If Timaeus gives us the outline, Critias gives us the portrait. The dialogue called Critias is where Plato provides the full, vivid, almost obsessive description of Atlantis. This is where the legend truly comes to life. This is the text that has driven explorers mad with desire to find it. Plato begins with the gods. When the gods divided the world among themselves, Poseidon received the island of Atlantis. On this island lived a mortal man named Evenor and his wife Lucip. They had a daughter, Plato, beautiful beyond measure. Poseidon fell in love with her. After her parents died, he made the hill where she lived into a fortress to protect her. He carved the land into alternate rings of sea and land, 2 rings of land and 3 rings of water, all perfectly circular, all centered on the hill. No mortal ship could reach the center. Plato was safe. Poseidon and Cleito had 10 sons. The firstborn was named Atlas, and he became the first king. The island and the ocean itself were named after him. Atlas and his 9 brothers divided the island into 10 kingdoms, but Atlas, as the eldest, ruled over all. And so the royal line of Atlantis began. Plato then describes the island itself. It was rich beyond imagining. The soil was fertile. The forests were dense. There were mountains filled with precious metals and stones. There were animals of every kind, including, Plato says, elephants. But the most precious substance of all was orichalcum. This was a metal, Plato writes, that shone with a red, fiery light. It was mined from the earth and was valued second only to gold. We do not know what orichalcum was. Some have guessed it was a type of brass or bronze. Others believe it was purely mythical, a detail Plato invented. But in his story, it was everywhere. The kings of Atlantis, over many generations, transformed the island into a marvel of engineering. They built bridges across the rings of water, connecting the center to the outer land. They dug a great canal from the sea to the outermost ring, large enough for ships to sail through. They carved tunnels through the rings of land, roofed over so that ships could pass unseen from one ring to the next. At the very center, on the original hill where Plato once lived, they built a palace. The palace was surrounded by a wall covered in brass. Inside that was another wall, covered in tin. And the innermost wall, surrounding the palace itself, was covered in orichalcum, glowing like fire in the sun. Inside the palace was a temple to Poseidon. It was massive. The outside was covered in silver, the pinnacles in gold. Inside, the ceiling was ivory, inlaid with gold, silver, and orichalcum. The walls were lined with statues. At the center stood a statue of Poseidon himself, so tall his head touched the ceiling. He stood in a chariot pulled by winged horses, surrounded by Nereids riding dolphins. Everything in Atlantis was built on a massive scale. The harbours were crowded with ships. The outer ring of land was filled with dense housing for merchants and sailors. The sounds of commerce, the shouts of traders, the ring of hammers, never stopped, day or night. Beyond the city itself, the island was divided into perfect, rectangular zones. Each zone was assigned to a portion of the population. There were irrigation canals, farms, and villages. Everything was orderly. Everything was planned. The military might of Atlantis was staggering. Plato gives precise numbers. Each rectangular zone of the plain was required to provide 1 military leader, along with chariots, horses, cavalry, infantry, and ships. All told, Atlantis could field an army of over 1 million men and a navy of 1,200 ships. This was the physical empire. But what about the people? At first, Plato writes, the kings of Atlantis were good. They remembered their divine ancestry. They ruled with wisdom and justice. They valued virtue over wealth. They were content. But over time, something changed. The divine blood in their veins grew thinner with each generation. The mortal nature began to dominate. They became ambitious. They became greedy. They began to lust for power and conquest. What had been a noble civilization began to rot from within. Zeus, the king of the gods, saw this. He saw how corruption had spread through Atlantis. He saw that they were preparing for unjust wars. And so he decided to punish them, to teach them a lesson. Zeus called all the gods together to his palace. He prepared to speak. He was about to announce the judgment of Atlantis. And then the dialogue ends. Mid-sentence, we never find out what Zeus said. We never learn the details of Atlantis's final destruction. The text simply stops. Was Plato interrupted? Did he die before finishing? Did he abandon the project, realizing it had grown too large, too unwieldy? We will never know. But what he left behind was enough. Enough detail to make Atlantis feel real. Enough precision to make people believe it could be found. Enough mystery to ensure it would never be forgotten. Chapter 4. What Plato's contemporaries thought. Plato died in 347 BC. He left behind his unfinished story, and immediately the debate began. Was Atlantis real, or was it fiction? This question divided the ancient world, just as it divides us today. But the ancient Greeks and Romans had one advantage we do not. They lived closer to Plato's time. They could examine the story with fresh eyes, without 24 centuries of mythology piled on top. And their opinions were split. The first and most influential voice belonged to Aristotle, Plato's own student. Aristotle had studied at Plato's academy for 20 years. He knew his teacher's methods. He knew how Plato used myths and allegories to illustrate philosophical truths. And Aristotle did not believe Atlantis was real. He left behind a famous, cutting remark. He said, "He who invented it also destroyed it." In other words, Plato made up Atlantis, and Plato sank it. It was a literary device, a thought experiment, nothing more. Aristotle believed the story was created to demonstrate Plato's political philosophy. The ideal state of ancient Athens represented the Republic, the perfect city Plato had described in his earlier work. Atlantis represented imperial ambition, the corruption of power, the danger of hubris. The destruction of both cities was a warning. Even the best societies can fall. But not everyone agreed with Aristotle. A philosopher named Crantor, who lived just a generation after Plato, took the story literally. He was the first person we know of to write a commentary on Plato's Timaeus, and in that commentary he argued that Atlantis was historical fact. Crantor claimed he had travelled to Egypt himself. He said that the Egyptian priests had shown him columns, pillars inscribed with the same story Plato had written. He believed the account was genuine. Unfortunately, Crantor's original work has been lost. We only know about his opinion because later writers referenced it. We cannot examine his evidence. We cannot verify his claim about the Egyptian pillars. They have never been found. Other ancient thinkers took a middle position. Strabo, the great Greek geographer who lived during the time of Augustus Caesar, wrote about Atlantis cautiously. He acknowledged Plato's story, but suggested it was a mixture of fact and philosophical invention. He noted that lands could indeed sink or rise due to earthquakes and volcanic activity. He pointed to real examples, places where islands had appeared or disappeared within living memory. But Strabo also pointed out the obvious problem. If Atlantis had been as large as Plato described, larger than Libya and Asia combined, its destruction would have left massive evidence. The ocean floor would be disturbed. There would be legends from every coastal culture. And yet, there was nothing. The philosopher Plutarch, writing in the 1st century AD, also discussed Atlantis. He treated it as a serious topic, but with reservation. He suggested that Plato had taken inspiration from real places and events, then reshaped them to suit his philosophical message. Perhaps there had been a powerful island civilization. Perhaps it had fallen. But the details, the perfect circles, the divine ancestry, the precise numbers, these were literary embellishments. Why did the ancient world struggle with this question? Because Plato's reputation was complicated. He was known for using myths. The allegory of the cave, the myth of these were clearly fictional stories designed to illustrate ideas. But Plato also claimed to be searching for truth. He valued reason and evidence. He criticized poets for spreading lies. So which was Atlantis? Truth or allegory? Even his contemporaries could not agree. Chapter 5. The Roman Era Debate. As the centuries passed and Greece fell under Roman rule, the story of Atlantis continued to evolve. The Romans were practical people, less interested in philosophy than in engineering and conquest. But they inherited the Greek love of knowledge, and Roman scholars studied Plato carefully. One of the most important Roman voices was Pliny the Elder. He lived in the 1st century AD and wrote a massive encyclopedia called Natural History. It covered everything from astronomy to zoology, from medicine to mining. Pliny was skeptical by nature, but he believed that catastrophic geological events were real. He had seen Mount Vesuvius erupt. He had witnessed the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum. In fact, he would die trying to rescue people during that very eruption in 79 AD. Pliny documented many examples of land rising and sinking, islands appearing overnight due to volcanic activity, coastlines changing after earthquakes. He noted that the forces of nature were powerful enough to reshape the earth, but he never claimed to have evidence of Atlantis specifically. He treated it as a philosophical tale, one that reflected a deeper truth about the instability of the world. Jewish and early Christian writers also grappled with the Atlantis story, but through a different lens. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher writing in the 1st century AD, saw Atlantis as a moral allegory. He believed Plato was warning against pride and materialism. The people of Atlantis had everything: wealth, power, beauty, and they threw it away through arrogance. This fit perfectly with Jewish teachings about hubris and divine judgment. Early Christian thinkers made a different connection. They saw parallels between Atlantis and the biblical flood. In the book of Genesis, God destroys the wicked world with water, sparing only Noah and his family. The flood was divine punishment for human corruption. Atlantis, they argued, could be another version of this same event. Perhaps Plato had heard echoes of the true flood story, distorted through Egyptian sources. Perhaps Atlantis was one of the civilizations destroyed in that great deluge. This interpretation allowed Christians to accept Atlantis as real, but only as a fragment of biblical history. It was not a lost civilization to be sought. It was a cautionary tale that confirmed scripture. By the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, a school of philosophy called Neoplatonism had emerged. These thinkers revered Plato and studied his works with religious devotion, but they read everything symbolically. To the Neoplatonists, Atlantis was not a real place. It was a map of the human soul. The concentric circles represented levels of consciousness. The outer rings were the material world, base and corrupt. The inner rings were higher spiritual states. The central island, where Poseidon's temple stood, was the divine spark within every person. The war between Athens and Atlantis was not a historical event. It was the eternal struggle between reason and desire, between the soul's higher and lower natures. The destruction of Atlantis represented the fate of those who live only for material wealth and power. They sink into ignorance and oblivion. Every detail had symbolic meaning. The metals, brass, tin, orichalcum, were stages of spiritual refinement. The 10 kings were the 10 faculties of the soul. Even the numbers, the dimensions of the canals and walls, contained hidden geometric truths. This allegorical reading would dominate European thought for over 1,000 years. During the Middle Ages, Christian monks copied Plato's texts and studied them in monasteries. But they read Atlantis as myth, not history. The ancient world, then, gave us no consensus. Some believed, some doubted, some reinterpreted. But one fact remained constant: there was only one source. Only Plato. No other ancient writer, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, or otherwise, ever mentioned Atlantis independently. If it was real, why the silence? That question would haunt every future generation. Chapter 6. Renaissance Revival. For 1,000 years, Atlantis slept. During the Middle Ages, Europe was fragmented, inward-looking, consumed by war and plague. The works of Plato survived in monasteries, copied by monks, but read primarily as allegory. The ancient world felt distant, unreachable. No one was searching for lost continents. But in the 15th century, everything changed. The Renaissance began in Italy and spread across Europe. It was a rebirth of interest in classical learning, art, and science. Scholars rediscovered ancient texts. Artists studied Greek sculpture. Thinkers questioned old assumptions. And at the same time, the age of exploration began. Portuguese sailors pushed down the coast of Africa. Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. Suddenly, the world was bigger than anyone had imagined. There were continents that the ancients had never known. There were civilizations that had risen and fallen in total isolation. If the Americas could exist, unknown to Europe for thousands of years, what else might be hidden? This question brought Atlantis back to life. One of the first to make the connection was a Spanish historian named Francisco López de Gomara. Writing in the 1550s, he suggested that the Americas were the remnants of Atlantis. Perhaps Plato's story had been garbled over time. Perhaps the continent had not sunk entirely. Perhaps its mountains had remained above water, and those peaks were the islands of the Caribbean. It was a bold idea, but it had problems. The Americas were not in ruins. They were thriving. The Aztecs and Incas had built magnificent empires. These were not the remnants of a destroyed civilization. They were living cultures with their own histories. But the seed was planted. Atlantis and the New World were now linked in the European imagination. The most influential Renaissance thinker to explore this idea was Sir Francis Bacon. He was an English philosopher, scientist, and statesman, one of the founders of the scientific method. In 1627, he published a book called The New Atlantis. It was a utopian novel, a story about sailors who discover a hidden island in the Pacific Ocean. The island is called Bensalem, and it is a perfect society. Its people are wise, peaceful, and scientifically advanced. They live in harmony, guided by reason. Bacon never explicitly said that Bensalem was the real Atlantis. But the connection was clear. He was using Plato's myth to imagine what an ideal society could look like, and he placed it in the New World, the land of possibility. The New Atlantis became hugely influential. It shaped how Europeans thought about the Americas. It suggested that perhaps the New World could become a place where humanity started over, building a better civilization, free from the corruption of the Old World. This idea would echo through centuries. It would influence the founding of the United States. The notion of America as a land of new beginnings, a place to build the ideal republic, owes a debt to Bacon and to Plato before him. But Bacon was writing fiction. He was not claiming to have found Atlantis. He was using it as inspiration. The real searches, the true obsession, would not begin until the 19th century. Chapter 7. Ignatius Donnelly and Modern Atlantis Mania. In 1882, a former congressman from Minnesota, named Ignatius Donnelly, published a book. Its title was Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It became an instant, massive bestseller. It went through edition after edition. It was translated into multiple languages, and it changed everything. Donnelly's book made Atlantis a household name. Before him, it was a scholarly curiosity, a philosophical footnote. After him, it was a global phenomenon. It was the lost motherland of humanity. It was ancient aliens. It was buried treasure. It was the answer to every mystery. Who was Ignatius Donnelly? He was a fascinating, complicated man. He had been a politician, a lawyer, and a passionate believer in radical ideas. He was drawn to grand theories, sweeping explanations that connected everything. He believed that Francis Bacon had secretly written Shakespeare's plays. He believed that an ancient comet had struck the Earth and caused mass extinctions. And he believed absolutely that Atlantis was real. Donnelly's central argument was simple but seductive. He claimed that all the ancient civilizations of the world, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the Olmecs, had a common origin. They had all descended from a single, older, more advanced civilization, Atlantis. This, he said, explained why pyramids existed on both sides of the Atlantic. The Egyptians built pyramids. The Maya and Aztecs built pyramids. They must have learned from the same source. It explained why flood myths existed in every culture. The Greeks had their deluge. The Bible had Noah. The Mesopotamians had Gilgamesh. The Hindus had Manu. All of these, Donnelly argued, were memories of the same event, the destruction of Atlantis. It explained linguistic similarities. He pointed to words in different languages that sounded alike and claimed they proved a common Atlantean origin. Modern linguists have thoroughly debunked this. Languages evolve in complex ways. Coincidental similarities prove nothing. But in Donnelly's time, linguistics was a young science, and his arguments sounded convincing. Donnelly filled his book with tables, charts, and maps. He cited ancient texts, sometimes accurately, often not. He made wild leaps of logic, but he presented them with confidence. He wrote like a prosecutor making a case, overwhelming the reader with sheer volume of claimed evidence. Why did it work? Why did so many people believe him? Because he was telling people what they wanted to hear. The late 19th century was an age of empire and industrialization. Western nations were colonizing the world. They believed in progress, in the superiority of their own civilization, but they were also anxious. Technology was changing everything. Traditional ways of life were disappearing. People felt unmoored. Donnelly offered a comforting myth. He said that all civilization came from one glorious source. He suggested that humanity had once been united, advanced, and noble. We had fallen, but we could rise again. It was a myth of origins, of lost greatness, of hope. It was also, though Donnelly likely did not intend this, a myth that could be twisted. If all civilization came from one place, then some people were closer to that pure source than others. This idea would later be misused by racial theorists and occultists to justify terrible ideologies. But in 1882, Donnelly's book simply seemed exciting. It seemed like a revelation, and it launched an industry. Within decades, hundreds of books, articles, and lectures appeared, all claiming to have solved the mystery of Atlantis. Some were sincere, some were fraudulent. All of them owed a debt to Donnelly. The search for Atlantis had become a cultural obsession. Chapter 8: 20th Century Theories. The Candidates. The 20th century saw the search for Atlantis explode in every direction. Explorers, archaeologists, geologists, mystics, and charlatans all claimed to have found it, or to know where it was, or to have received visions of its location. Dozens of sites have been proposed. Some are plausible, some are absurd. None have produced definitive proof. Let us examine the most famous candidates. Santorini and the Minoans, the scientific favourite. The most widely accepted theory among serious scholars is that Plato's Atlantis was inspired by the real collapse of the Minoan civilization. The Minoans lived on the island of Crete and surrounding Aegean islands. They flourished during the Bronze Age, roughly from 3000 to 1100 BC. They were sophisticated. They built palaces with running water, frescoes, and advanced architecture. They were a maritime power, trading across the Mediterranean. Their largest settlement outside Crete was on the island of Thera, which we now call Santorini. Around 1600 BC, the volcano at the centre of Santorini erupted. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The explosion was catastrophic. It destroyed the island. It triggered massive tsunamis. It sent ash clouds across the region, darkening the skies. The Minoan civilization never fully recovered. Within a few generations, it collapsed entirely. Could this be the event Plato was describing? The parallels are striking. An advanced island civilization. A sudden, violent destruction involving earthquakes and floods. A society that vanished, leaving behind ruins and myths. But there are problems. First, the timeline. Plato said Atlantis sank 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, around 9600 BC. The Santorini eruption happened around 1600 BC. That is a difference of 8,000 years. Could Plato have been so wrong? Some scholars suggest the Egyptian priests made a translation error. Perhaps they said 900 years, not 9,000. That would place the event much closer to the Minoan collapse. But this is speculation. Plato's text clearly says 9,000. Second, the location. Plato said Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. Santorini is in the Aegean Sea, well within the Mediterranean. Could Plato have been confused about basic geography? Could he have deliberately changed the location to make the story more dramatic? Again, possible, but it requires us to believe Plato was either ignorant or dishonest. Third, the size. Plato said Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined. Santorini, even before the eruption, was a small island. It could never have supported the vast empire Plato described. Despite these issues, the Santorini theory remains popular because it is grounded in real archaeology. The Minoans existed, their collapse was real, and it is easy to imagine how a distant memory of that catastrophe could have evolved into Plato's myth. Antarctica, the extreme theory. One of the wildest theories came from a man named Charles Hapgood. In 1958, he published a book called Earth's Shifting Crust. Hapgood proposed that the Earth's crust could shift suddenly, sliding over the mantle like the skin of an orange. If this happened, entire continents could move thousands of miles. Temperate zones could become frozen. Frozen zones could become warm. He claimed that Antarctica had once been located much farther north, in a temperate zone. An advanced civilization had lived there, thriving in a mild climate. Then, around 12,000 years ago, the crust shifted. Antarctica slid south to its current position. The civilization was buried under ice. That civilization, Hapgood argued, was Atlantis. To support his theory, he pointed to the Piri Reis map, a 16th century Turkish naval chart. The map appears to show the coastline of Antarctica with accurate details that would only be visible if the ice were gone. Hapgood claimed this proved ancient civilizations had mapped Antarctica before it froze. The theory gained some famous supporters, including Albert Einstein, who wrote a foreword to Hapgood's book, but mainstream scientists rejected it entirely. Why? Because there is no mechanism for sudden crustal shifts. Plate tectonics move slowly, over millions of years. There is no evidence of rapid, catastrophic movement in the geological record. And the Piri Reis map has been explained by historians as a compilation of earlier European maps, with errors and exaggerations common in that era. The Antarctica theory is popular in fringe circles, but it has no scientific support. The Bahamas and Bimini Road. In the 1930s, a psychic named Edgar Cayce made thousands of predictions while in a trance state. He claimed to channel information from the spirit world. One of his most famous predictions was about Atlantis. He said that Atlantis had existed in the Caribbean and that its ruins would begin to rise from the sea near the island of Bimini in 1968 or 1969. In 1968, a pilot flying over shallow water near Bimini spotted something unusual. It appeared to be a stone road or wall, lying just beneath the surface. It was roughly half a mile long, made of large rectangular blocks arranged in a straight line. Atlantis hunters were ecstatic. Edgar Cayce had predicted this. Here was the proof. But geologists investigated and quickly identified what it really was: beach rock. This is a natural formation where sand and shells cement together into slabs. Over time, the slabs crack into rectangular shapes that can look man-made. But they are not. Studies of the Bimini Road showed no tool marks, no evidence of quarrying, no sign of human construction. It was nature, not Atlantis. Still, the site remains a pilgrimage destination for believers. The Strait of Gibraltar. Some researchers have focused on the area Plato actually described, just beyond the Pillars of Hercules. In recent years, sonar scans of the seafloor near the Strait of Gibraltar have revealed unusual formations. Some appear to be rectangular, like foundations. Could these be the ruins of Atlantis? Possibly, but more likely they are natural geological features or remnants of known ancient settlements. The region was heavily populated in antiquity. Cities rose and fell. Coastlines changed due to erosion and rising sea levels. One candidate is Tartessos, a real Bronze Age civilization that existed in southern Spain. It was wealthy, maritime, and mysterious. It disappeared suddenly, possibly due to natural disaster. Some scholars believe Plato might have heard stories about Tartessos and woven them into his Atlantis myth. But again, this requires us to ignore Plato's timeline and the scale of his description. Why? Every location fails. Here is the fundamental problem. Every proposed location for Atlantis requires us to ignore part of Plato's account. If we take the timeline seriously, 9600 BC, then we are in the Stone Age. No advanced civilization existed anywhere on Earth. Humans were hunter-gatherers. If we take the location seriously, the Atlantic Ocean beyond Gibraltar, then geological surveys show no evidence of a sunken continent. The ocean floor has been mapped. It is not hiding a massive landmass. If we take the size seriously, larger than Libya and Asia, then no island in recorded history comes close. Believers must choose. They can accept part of Plato's story and reject the rest. But they cannot accept it all. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If we have to change Plato's account to make it fit reality, are we still looking for Atlantis? Or are we just looking for any lost civilization and calling it Atlantis? Chapter 9. What geology actually tells us. Let us now turn from myth and speculation to hard science. What does modern geology tell us about the possibility of Atlantis? Can a continent sink beneath the ocean in a single day and night? The short answer is no. To understand why, we need to understand how the Earth actually works. For most of human history, people believed the ground beneath their feet was stable and unchanging. Mountains were eternal. Continents were fixed. The geography of the world was set at creation. But in the 20th century, geologists discovered something revolutionary. The Earth's surface is not solid. It is broken into massive plates that float on a layer of molten rock beneath. These plates move, slowly but constantly, driven by heat from the Earth's core. This is called plate tectonics, and it explains almost everything about our planet's geography. Mountains form where plates collide and crumple upward. Ocean trenches form where one plate slides beneath another. Earthquakes happen along the boundaries where plates grind together. But here is the critical point. These movements are slow. Plates move at about the same rate your fingernails grow, a few centimeters per year. Over millions of years, continents can drift thousands of miles. India crashed into Asia, creating the Himalayas. The Atlantic Ocean opened as Europe and America separated. But in a single day, impossible. There is no known geological mechanism that could cause a continent-sized landmass to sink rapidly. Rock is not like a ship that can spring a leak. The Earth's crust floats on denser rock below. For land to sink, it would need to become denser than the material beneath it, and that does not happen suddenly. What about volcanic islands? Can they sink? Yes, but not the way Atlantis supposedly did. Volcanic islands are created when magma pushes up through the ocean floor. Over time, the volcano can become dormant, and the island begins to erode. Meanwhile, the ocean floor beneath it cools and contracts, causing the island to slowly subside. Eventually, it can sink below the surface entirely. This process takes hundreds of thousands of years, sometimes millions. It is not sudden. It is not catastrophic. There are exceptions. When a volcano erupts violently, it can partially collapse, as happened at Santorini. But the island does not disappear. It leaves behind a caldera, a crater that fills with water. Santorini still exists. You can visit it today. So, what about the Atlantic Ocean itself? Could a continent be hiding beneath it? No, and we know this with absolute certainty. The entire Atlantic seafloor has been mapped using sonar and other technologies. We have detailed images of every ridge, trench, and Plato. In the middle of the ocean is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a massive underwater mountain range where new ocean floor is constantly being created as plates pull apart. There is no sunken continent. There are no mysterious ruins. There are only the expected geological features of a spreading ocean. But what about earthquakes and floods? Could those destroy a civilization in one day? Yes, absolutely. This part of Plato's story is scientifically plausible. History is filled with examples of sudden disasters wiping out cities. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 AD. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 destroyed one of Europe's great capitals in minutes. The Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004 killed over 200,000 people. These disasters can strike with terrifying speed. Entire coastal cities can be swallowed by the sea. Buildings can collapse. Fires can spread. Within hours, a thriving metropolis can become a ruin. So this part of the Atlantis story is believable. A coastal city, hit by a massive earthquake and tsunami, could be destroyed in a day and night. But here is the difference. The city sinks, not the land. The ruins remain on the seafloor. They do not vanish. They can be found. And this is where the Atlantis story falls apart geologically. Plato said the entire island sank. He said it left the sea unnavigable with mud. This suggests a landmass disappearing and leaving shallow debris behind. But if a city is simply flooded, the land is still there. The ocean depth does not change. Ships can still sail over it. So what are we left with? A scientifically impossible story. A continent that cannot sink. An ocean that has been thoroughly explored. A timeline that places advanced civilization thousands of years before any existed. But there is one more problem, and it may be the most damning of all. Chapter 10. What archaeology says. Archaeology is the science of uncovering the past through physical evidence. Pottery, tools, buildings, bones. These are the fragments that tell us how people lived, what they believed, and when they existed. If Atlantis was real, archaeology should be able to find it. And not just the city itself. An empire as vast as Plato described would leave traces everywhere. There would be Atlantean pottery in other countries, brought by trade. There would be ruins of Atlantean colonies. There would be written records from their neighbours, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Mesopotamians, describing this powerful rival. But there is nothing. Not a single artifact, not one inscription, not even a rumour in any text other than Plato's. This is deeply suspicious. Compare this to other ancient civilizations. When archaeologists began searching for Troy, the legendary city from Homer's Iliad, many believed it was purely mythical. But in the 1870s, Heinrich Schliemann excavated a site in Turkey and found the ruins of an ancient city that matched the description. Troy was real. The same happened with the Hittites, an empire mentioned in the Bible but unknown to modern scholars. In the early 1900s, archaeologists found their capital in Turkey, along with thousands of clay tablets in their language. The Hittites existed. Even the Minoans, whose name comes from the legendary King Minos, were thought to be mythical until Sir Arthur Evans excavated the palace of Knossos in Crete in 1900. The palace was real. The civilization was real. So why not Atlantis? Because unlike Troy or the Hittites, Atlantis left no trace. And for an empire of its supposed size and power, that is impossible. Large civilizations are messy. They produce vast amounts of material. They trade with neighbors, spreading their goods across regions. They build roads, temples, fortifications. They bury their dead with offerings. They carve inscriptions proclaiming their victories. Even when a civilization collapses, the debris remains. We have found the ruins of countless lost cities. Pompeii, buried under ash. Machu Picchu, hidden in the jungle. Angkor Wat, swallowed by the forest. Petra, carved into cliffs. These places were abandoned, forgotten, but they did not disappear. If Atlantis sank beneath the sea, its ruins should still be there on the ocean floor. And modern underwater archaeology is incredibly advanced. We have found Bronze Age shipwrecks with intact cargo. We have discovered submerged cities like Pavlopetri in Greece, a town that sank around 3,000 years ago. Every building, every street, is still visible beneath the water. If Atlantis existed in the location Plato described, we would have found it by now. But there is an even bigger problem: the timeline. Plato said Atlantis existed 9,600 years before his time. That places it around 11,400 years ago, in 9600 BC. What was the world like then? The last ice age was ending. Sea levels were rising as glaciers melted. Humans lived in small groups as hunter-gatherers. They made stone tools. They lived in temporary shelters or caves. They had no writing, no cities, no agriculture. The first permanent settlements, like Jericho in the Jordan Valley, appeared around 9000 BC. The first true cities, like Uruk in Mesopotamia, did not appear until around 4000 BC. Advanced maritime civilizations, with large ships and trade networks, came even later. There is no archaeological evidence for any advanced civilization in 9600 BC. None, anywhere on Earth. If we reject Plato's timeline and argue that Atlantis existed later, say, during the Bronze Age, then we are no longer talking about the Atlantis Plato described. We are inventing a new story. And if we do that, we must ask, why call it Atlantis at all? There is one final point worth considering. Some argue that advanced civilizations could have existed and left no trace. Perhaps they built everything from wood, which rotted away. Perhaps they avoided leaving written records. Perhaps a cataclysm destroyed all evidence. But this is special pleading. It is inventing excuses for why evidence does not exist. Science does not work that way. We base our conclusions on evidence, not on the absence of evidence. Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, once said, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." The claim that a continent-sized advanced civilization existed 11,000 years ago, ruled the Mediterranean, and then vanished without a trace, is extraordinary. The evidence is zero. That does not mean the story has no value. Myths can teach us truths. Legends can inspire us. But we must be honest about what they are. Atlantis is not a historical fact waiting to be discovered. It is a story Plato told 2,400 years ago, and that story has taken on a life of its own. Chapter 11. The Psychology of Atlantis. We have seen the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. Geologically impossible, archaeologically absent, historically unsupported. And yet, the belief in Atlantis has never been stronger. Why? Why do millions of people around the world continue to believe in a lost civilization that almost certainly never existed? Why do new books, documentaries, and theories appear every year? Why does the search continue? The answer lies not in the past, but in the human mind. Atlantis endures because it fulfills deep psychological needs. It speaks to something primal in us. It offers answers to fears and desires that logic cannot satisfy. Let us begin with the most powerful: nostalgia for a lost golden age. Every culture on Earth has a myth of paradise lost. The Bible has the Garden of Eden. The Greeks had the golden age of Kronos. The Hindus have the Satya Yuga. Norse mythology has the time before Ragnarok. The Chinese speak of the age of the sage kings. These stories all follow the same pattern. Once, long ago, life was perfect. People were wise, virtuous, and happy. There was no war, no suffering, no corruption. Then something went wrong. Humanity fell. We were cast out of paradise. The golden age ended, and we have lived in decline ever since. Atlantis fits this pattern perfectly. It was an advanced, prosperous, harmonious society. Then it grew corrupt and was destroyed. It is Eden with pyramids. It is the fall, but with earthquakes instead of apples. Why do we need these stories? Because the present is hard. Life is filled with struggle, disappointment, and loss. We look around and see suffering, injustice, environmental destruction. The world feels broken. The myth of the Golden Age offers comfort. It tells us that things were once better. It suggests that the brokenness is not permanent, not inevitable. If humanity was once great, we can be great again. If we had wisdom, we can rediscover it. Atlantis gives us hope, disguised as history. But there is a darker side to this nostalgia. The Golden Age myth can be used to justify reactionary politics. If the past was perfect, then change is corruption. If we have fallen, then progress is a lie. We must return to the old ways, the pure ways, the lost ways. This is dangerous thinking. It ignores the reality that the past was often brutal, unjust, and short. It romanticizes suffering and elevates myths over facts. The second psychological need Atlantis fulfills is the desire for hidden knowledge. Modern life is complicated and impersonal. We are told what to think by governments, corporations, and experts. We are taught in schools using standardized curriculums. We rely on scientists and scholars to interpret the world for us. Many people feel powerless in the face of this authority. They feel that the truth is being kept from them. Atlantis offers an alternative. It suggests that there is secret knowledge, ancient wisdom that the mainstream refuses to acknowledge. It tells us that academics are closed-minded, that governments are hiding evidence, that there is a conspiracy to suppress the truth. This is deeply appealing. It makes the believer feel special. They are not like the masses who blindly accept what they are told. They have seen through the lies. They know the secret. This is why Atlantis theories often appear alongside other alternative beliefs. Ancient aliens, lost supercivilizations, free energy, suppressed technologies. These ideas share a common structure. They all claim that the official story is wrong and that only a select few know the real truth. Psychologists call this conspiracist ideation, and it is a powerful force. It provides identity, community, and purpose. It turns belief into rebellion, but it also cuts people off from reality. When evidence contradicts the belief, the evidence is rejected as part of the conspiracy. The theory becomes unfalsifiable. No amount of proof can change the believer's mind. The third reason Atlantis endures is fear. Fear of loss. Fear of impermanence. Fear that our own civilization could collapse just as suddenly. Atlantis was destroyed in a single day. No warning. No escapee. A thriving empire, gone in an instant. This is a terrifying thought, and it mirrors our deepest anxieties. We live in an age of global threats. Climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemics, economic collapse, the extinction of species, the instability of democracies. We know, intellectually, that our civilization is fragile. History shows us that every empire falls eventually. Rome, Persia, Egypt, they all crumbled. Why should we be different? Atlantis is a warning. It says, this could happen to you. And in a strange way, that warning is comforting. It acknowledges our fear. It tells us we are right to be anxious. It externalizes the dread we feel into a story we can examine from a safe distance. But here is the paradox. While Atlantis warns us of collapse, it also suggests that collapse is not the end. After all, we remember Atlantis. We talk about it. We search for it. Even in destruction, it achieved a kind of immortality. Perhaps that is the hidden message. Not that we should fear the fall, but that even if we fall, something of us will endure. Chapter 12. Atlantis in popular culture. The psychological appeal of Atlantis is one thing, but its dominance in popular culture is another. Atlantis is everywhere. It is in movies, television shows, novels, comic books, and video games. It has been reimagined thousands of times, each version adding new layers to the myth. In literature, Atlantis has been a source of inspiration for centuries. Jules Verne sent Captain Nemo to its ruins in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. H. P. Lovecraft placed it in the prehistory of his cosmic horror mythos. J. R. R. Tolkien's Númenor, the doomed island kingdom in The Lord of the Rings, is directly modelled on Atlantis. Modern fantasy and science fiction authors continue the tradition. From children's books to epic sagas, Atlantis appears again and again as the lost source of magic, the hidden origin of humanity, or the cautionary tale of hubris. In film and television, Atlantis has been portrayed in every possible way. Disney's Atlantis, the Lost Empire, imagined it as a steampunk underground city. The Stargate franchise turned it into a flying alien city. Aquaman placed it on the ocean floor, ruled by superheroes. Documentaries on the History Channel speculate endlessly about its location, often blurring the line between investigation and entertainment. Video games have embraced Atlantis with enthusiasm. Players can explore its ruins, rebuild its civilization, or even become its ruler. The Lost City has become a standard setting, as familiar as medieval castles or outer space. Why does Atlantis work so well in fiction? Because it is a blank canvas. Plato gave us just enough detail to spark the imagination, but not so much that we are constrained. Writers can invent their own version of Atlantis, filling in the gaps however they like. It can be utopian or dystopian, magical or technological, ancient or futuristic. It can be a cautionary tale, an adventure setting, or a symbol of whatever theme the creator wants to explore. This flexibility has kept Atlantis alive for 24 centuries. But there is a special reason why Atlantis resonates so strongly with American audiences, and it is worth examining. America has always seen itself as a new beginning, a place where the old mistakes of Europe could be avoided. The Founding Fathers studied classical history. They designed a republic inspired by Athens and Rome, hoping to avoid the tyranny and corruption that destroyed those civilizations. But they also feared decline. They knew that republics do not last forever. They worried that America, too, could fall into decadence, lose its virtue, and collapse. Atlantis is the perfect myth for this anxiety. It is a powerful republic that grew corrupt and fell. It is a warning that even the greatest civilizations are not immortal. At the same time, Atlantis represents discovery and exploration, core American values. The idea that there is a lost continent waiting to be found appeals to the frontier spirit, the belief that there are still great mysteries to solve, new worlds to claim. This combination of hope and fear, of ambition and caution, makes Atlantis especially potent in American culture. It is no coincidence that Ignatius Donnelly, the man who reignited modern Atlantis mania, was American. It is no coincidence that so many Atlantis theories place it in the Caribbean or the Americas. It is no coincidence that American filmmakers and authors return to the story again and again. Atlantis is, in many ways, a mirror. We see in it what we want to see: our hopes, our fears, our dreams of greatness, our terror of failure, and that is why it will never disappear. As long as humans tell stories, Atlantis will be part of those stories. Because it is not really about a lost city, it is about us. Chapter 13. What Plato was really doing. We have journeyed through 24 centuries of speculation, searched every ocean, examined every theory. Now we must return to where it all began, to Athens, to Plato, and to the question that matters most. What was he actually doing when he wrote about Atlantis? The scholarly consensus, built on decades of careful analysis, is clear. Atlantis was not a historical account. It was a philosophical allegory, a thought experiment, a story designed to illustrate ideas about politics, morality, and the rise and fall of civilizations. But let us examine the evidence carefully, because this conclusion is not based on dismissing Plato. It is based on understanding him. First, consider the structure of the dialogues themselves. Plato wrote philosophy as dramatic conversations. His characters were real people: Socrates, Critias, Timaeus, but the conversations themselves were fictional. Plato was not recording actual discussions. He was using dialogue as a literary form to explore ideas. This was his standard method. In the Republic, Socrates and his friends debate the nature of justice. In the Symposium, they discuss the nature of love. In Phaedo, they explore the immortality of the soul. None of these conversations literally happened. They are philosophical dramas, carefully crafted to lead the reader towards certain conclusions. The Timaeus and Critias follow the same pattern. They are dialogues, not histories. The story of Atlantis is embedded within a conversation about the ideal state, and this brings us to the second piece of evidence, the context. The Timaeus begins with Socrates summarizing the discussion from the Republic, Plato's earlier work about the perfect city. Socrates says he has described what an ideal state should look like in theory, but now he wants to see it in action. He wants a story that shows such a state actually functioning and facing challenges. This is the explicit setup. Plato is telling his readers, I am about to give you a practical example of the political philosophy I have been teaching. And then Critias tells the story of ancient Athens, the ideal state, and its war against Atlantis, the corrupt empire. This is not subtle. Plato is using Atlantis to make a political point. What is that point? Ancient Athens, as described in the dialogues, represents the perfect republic from Plato's earlier work. It is small, virtuous, disciplined. Its citizens are educated. Its leaders are wise. It lives in harmony with nature and the gods. Atlantis, by contrast, starts as a blessed civilization, but becomes corrupted by wealth and ambition. Its people forget their divine origins. They grow greedy and aggressive. They seek to conquer and enslave their neighbors. The war between these two civilizations is not just a historical event. It is a moral conflict. Virtue against vice. Simplicity against excess. Justice against imperialism. And the outcome is telling. Both civilizations are destroyed. Ancient Athens is swallowed by the earth at the moment of its greatest triumph. Atlantis sinks beneath the sea at the moment of its greatest hubris. What is Plato saying? He is warning that even the best societies are fragile. That power corrupts. That divine favor is not permanent. That empires rise and fall according to the moral character of their people. This is a theme Plato returned to again and again. He had witnessed the decline of Athens in his own lifetime. His city had lost the Peloponnesian War. Its democracy had failed. Its empire had collapsed. He had seen firsthand how arrogance and ambition could destroy a great civilization. The story of Atlantis is Athens, history written in mythological form. But there is more evidence. Consider how Plato presents the story. He does not cite multiple sources. He does not provide archaeological evidence. He does not send expeditions to find the ruins. Instead, he uses a complex framing device. Critias heard it from his grandfather, who heard it from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests, who read it from ancient records. This is a literary technique. It creates distance. It makes the story feel ancient and authoritative, while also protecting Plato from the obligation to prove it. Ancient readers would have recognized this. They were familiar with mythological storytelling. They understood that stories could be true in a deeper sense without being literally true. Aristotle, Plato's own student, certainly understood. That is why he dismissed Atlantis with a single cutting remark. He knew what his teacher was doing. There is one more detail that reveals Plato's intent, the unfinished ending. The dialogue Critias stops abruptly. Zeus is about to announce the punishment of Atlantis, and then the text ends mid-sentence. The story is never completed. Why? Some scholars believe Plato simply abandoned the project. Perhaps he realized the story had grown too complex. Perhaps he lost interest. Perhaps he died before finishing. But others suggest something more deliberate. Perhaps Plato left it unfinished because the ending did not matter. The point had already been made. The moral lesson was complete. The destruction itself was less important than the journey toward it. An unfinished dialogue is, in its own way, an admission. If Plato truly believed he was recording history, he would have finished it. The fate of such a significant civilization would demand completion. But if it was allegory, if it was a teaching tool, then the incompleteness is less troubling. The student has learned the lesson. The rest is unnecessary. Chapter 14. Possible, real inspirations. But even if Atlantis is fiction, that does not mean Plato invented it from nothing. Great stories are always built from fragments of reality. Writers take real places, real events, real anxieties, and reshape them into something new. Plato was no different. So, what might have inspired him? The most compelling possibility remains the Minoan collapse. Not as a direct account of Atlantis, but as a cultural memory that influenced the story. By Plato's time, the Minoans had been gone for over 1,000 years. But memories linger. Stories are passed down, distorted by time, mixed with other tales. The Greeks knew that great civilizations had once existed in the Aegean. They knew that islands could be destroyed by volcanic eruptions. They had heard of Thera, the island that exploded. It is entirely plausible that Plato drew on these distant memories when creating his allegory. He took the kernel of truth, a real civilization destroyed by natural disaster, and expanded it into a grand myth. But he changed key details. He moved the location to the Atlantic to make it more remote and mysterious. He pushed the timeline back 9,000 years to place it in a mythical past. He increased the scale to make it grander and more impressive. This is what storytellers do. They take inspiration from reality and transform it into something larger than life. Another possible inspiration is Sicily and the Greek colonies of southern Italy. In Plato's lifetime, these regions were hotbeds of conflict. Greek city-states had established wealthy colonies there, and they fought constantly among themselves and against the native peoples. The most powerful was Syracuse, a rich, aggressive city with a strong navy. Plato himself had visited Syracuse multiple times. He had witnessed its politics, its ambition, its corruption. He had tried and failed to advise its rulers on how to create a just government. Could Atlantis be, in part, a veiled criticism of Syracuse? Could the story of a naval empire that grew corrupt and overreached be a warning to the rulers Plato had met? It is possible. Plato often embedded contemporary political commentary in his dialogues. He was not above using mythology to make pointed critiques of real places and real people. There is also the matter of the Persian Wars. In the early 5th century BC, a generation before Plato was born, the vast Persian Empire invaded Greece. The Persians were everything the Greeks feared. They were enormous, wealthy, and autocratic. They commanded armies and fleets that dwarfed anything Greece could muster. And yet, against all odds, the Greeks won. At Marathon, at Salamis, at Plataea, they defeated the Persians and preserved their independence. This was the defining event of Greek identity. It was the proof that freedom and virtue could triumph over tyranny and excess. The story of Athens defeating Atlantis echoes this. A small, virtuous state facing a vast, aggressive empire. The triumph of the few over the many. Plato may have been reimagining the Persian Wars, transporting them into a mythical past to give them universal significance. But there is one final possibility, and it is the simplest. Perhaps Plato invented Atlantis entirely. Writers do this. Tolkien created Middle-earth. George Lucas created the Star Wars galaxy. These places feel real. They have detailed histories, languages, and geographies. Fans debate their details as if they were factual, but they are not. They are products of imagination, designed to tell stories and explore themes. Why should Atlantis be any different? Plato was a genius. He was one of the greatest thinkers in human history. He was perfectly capable of inventing an entire civilization from scratch, complete with architecture, government, and mythology. And if he did, that is not a disappointment. It is a testament to his creativity. He built something so compelling, so vivid, so emotionally resonant that people are still searching for it 2,400 years later. That is not failure. That is immortality. The truth is, we will never know for certain what inspired Plato. He left no notes explaining his sources, no drafts revealing his process. We have only the dialogues themselves and the silence of every other ancient text. But we can say this with confidence. Whether Atlantis was inspired by real events or invented whole, it was never meant to be a literal historical account. It was a story. A powerful, meaningful, enduring story. But a story nonetheless. Chapter 15. The Verdict. And so we arrive at the end of our journey. We have travelled from ancient Athens to the modern world. We have examined Plato's words. We have explored theories and evidence. We have dived into geology, archaeology, psychology, and culture. Now we must answer the question we began with. What do the ancient sources actually tell us about Atlantis? The answer is simple, and perhaps unsatisfying to some. There is only one ancient source, Plato. And Plato was writing philosophy, not history. No other writer in the ancient world, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, or otherwise, ever mentioned Atlantis independently. No archaeological evidence supports its existence. No geological mechanism could cause a continent to sink, as described. No civilization of the scale and advancement Plato described existed 11,000 years ago. Every piece of evidence, or rather, the absence of evidence, points to the same conclusion. Atlantis was not a real place. It was a literary creation. An allegory designed to teach lessons about virtue, power, and the fragility of civilization. Does this mean the search has been pointless? No, not at all. The search for Atlantis has led to real discoveries. Explorers looking for the lost city have found other lost cities. Pompeii, Troy, the Minoans, these were dismissed as myths, until archaeology proved them real. The hunt for Atlantis has pushed technology forward, developing better sonar, underwater cameras, and remote sensing tools. It has inspired generations of archaeologists, geologists, and oceanographers to pursue their fields. And it has given us something deeper. It has forced us to ask questions about our own civilization. How do societies rise? What causes them to fall? Are we repeating the mistakes of the past? What will future generations remember about us? These are valuable questions. They matter more than any sunken city. But we must also be honest. The search has had a darker side. It has fueled pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. It has been used to sell books, television shows, and fraudulent expeditions. It has distracted serious researchers with wild claims that waste time and resources. Belief in Atlantis, when it becomes dogma, when it rejects evidence and embraces fantasy, does harm. It teaches people to distrust science. It encourages them to believe that feelings are more important than facts. It opens the door to other irrational beliefs. So where does that leave us? With a choice. We can appreciate Atlantis for what it is. A beautiful, meaningful story created by one of history's greatest minds. We can learn from it. We can be inspired by it. We can use it as a lens to examine our own world. Or we can continue to insist it must be real, rejecting evidence, inventing excuses, chasing shadows. The first path leads to wisdom. The second leads to delusion. Plato would want us to choose wisdom. Chapter 16. The Enduring Mystery. But even as we accept the verdict of evidence, we must acknowledge something paradoxical. The mystery of Atlantis will never die. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Humans need mystery. We need stories that cannot be fully explained. We need myths that spark our imagination and challenge us to think beyond the ordinary. Atlantis gives us that. It is a puzzle with no solution, a question with no definitive answer. It invites us to wonder, to speculate, to dream. In a world that is increasingly mapped, measured, and explained, Atlantis represents the unknown. It is the last great mystery of the ancient world, the final frontier of lost civilizations. And there is something beautiful about that. The real treasure of Atlantis is not gold or advanced technology. It is not orichalcum or ancient wisdom. The real treasure is the search itself, the questions it raises, the conversations it inspires, the way it connects us to the past and to each other. Every generation rediscovers Atlantis and makes it their own. The Renaissance saw it as a new world utopia. The 19th century saw it as the mother of all civilizations. The 20th century saw it as alien technology. The 21st century sees it as a warning about climate change and environmental collapse. Atlantis is a mirror. It reflects whatever age is looking at it, and there is a lesson in that. The stories we tell about the past reveal more about our present than about history. When we search for Atlantis, we are really searching for ourselves. For meaning, for connection, for hope that humanity is capable of greatness, even if that greatness is sometimes lost. Plato understood this. That is why he wrote the story. Not to record history, but to challenge his readers. To make them think about power and virtue. To warn them about the dangers of hubris. To remind them that nothing lasts forever. 2,400 years later, his story still does that. It still challenges us. It still warns us. It still reminds us. That is the real magic of Atlantis. Not that it existed, but that it endures. As long as humans build civilizations, we will fear their collapse. As long as we seek wisdom, we will be drawn to stories of lost knowledge. As long as we dream of greatness, we will imagine golden ages in the past. And as long as we do these things, Atlantis will be with us. Not as a place on a map, not as ruins on the ocean floor, but as an idea, a story. A mystery that invites us to keep questioning, keep searching, keep wondering. Perhaps Plato intended this all along. Perhaps he knew his story would outlive him, outlive his city, outlive empires. Perhaps he smiled as he wrote the final, unfinished sentence, knowing that the mystery itself was the point. We will never know. But we can be grateful. Grateful for the story he gave us. Grateful for the questions it raises. Grateful for the reminder that even in an age of science and reason, there is still room for wonder. Atlantis may not be real, but the human need for stories like it is very real indeed. And that need will never sink beneath the waves. And so, our journey ends where it began, with a story told in ancient Athens. We have explored what the sources actually say. We have separated myth from history, hope from evidence. The answer may not be the one we wished for, but it is the truth. Thank you for joining me tonight. I hope you found wisdom in the search, even if the city remains lost. Until we meet again, I wish you calm seas and peaceful dreams. Good night.